I'm Stephanie Kirk. I'm the Director of the Center for Humanities, and I want to welcome everyone here today, those of us who are in person and popping in and out, and those of us who are joining via live stream. Before I make my opening comments and introduce our panelists, I'm going to welcome Mary McKay, Vice Provost of Interdisciplinary Initiatives, who's going to give some opening comments, and to whom I'm incredibly grateful for all her support. Thanks, everybody.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I loved one of our panelists, they waved to the people on Zoom. And so let me welcome people that are here in the room, but also virtually. I have the real privilege of welcoming our guests and all of you on behalf of Washington University and our Provost, Beverly Wendland. So there's a couple of things that I want to say. First of all, I think you have an exciting meeting ahead of you. It is not always typical enough that we come together across disciplines, across kind of roles to really think about what we're doing. Because what I know in my role, currently in the Provost's office, but as a former dean, a recovering dean, is that our systems are perfectly designed to get the outcomes that we do. And some of those outcomes fuel our work and our institution and the outcomes of that work forward. But some of our way we are set up holds us back from doing real innovative work. And so the idea that you are taking some hours to reflect on what we do, ask ourselves hard questions around, is this best practice for 2023? How might we incorporate new ideas? That's where this great panel comes in, but it's also the great ideas that come from all of us within the institution. So let me just say a couple of words about why this agenda, the program today is so important. Those of you that are at WashU, I hope that you know that we are engaged in a 10-year strategic planning process called Here and Next. Thank goodness some of you nodded yes. You know that. That's really important. Because we have spent a lot of time really being sure that we tried to be inclusive, we tried to hear voices, and we tried to actually spend some time out with all of you, helping you connect your work to our 10-year strategic plan called Here and Next. Those of you that are inside the house know that there are 3 pillars of Here and Next. There's a research pillar, a people pillar, a connection to our community in St. Louis, and really a bi-directional relationship between what happens in our local communities, how that influences what happens around the globe, and vice versa. What happens around the globe influences what happens in our community here. And so I cannot go through all the contours of the strategic plan, but those of you that have heard me talk before know that I get super excited. And I tell you, one of the signature priorities of Washington University is that we're going to start a new school. And by the way, Washington University doesn't do this very often. We haven't started a new school in 100 years. And so we're in the very intensely early planning stages of starting a new school for public health. Incredibly exciting. Lots of people weighing in on those plans, lots of stakeholders. And so when you hear me talk about those really exciting things. There's a WashU Leadership Institute, where faculty and staff and students, we want to cultivate and support you to take your next steps on this journey. That's part of the people pillar. So I have to say that I overly center in the times that I present Here and Next what I'm going to call the shiny objects. The things that really the community can get very excited about, that we can wonder where our role is, but can also be proud of us institutionally. But those of us, and all of you know, that in order to support those signature priorities, there is a lot of work to do within our institution. One of the key features of the new School of Public Health is that public health is defined as an interdisciplinary enterprise. It will have that school, both full-time faculty attributed to the school, but it will probably have more jointly appointed faculty in that school than we have in the whole of Washington University. So unless we get our policies right around joint appointments, we will never be able to pull that off, right? One of the things that's important about the strategic plan also is there's a set of value principles that are important in 2023 to the institution. What are some of those value principles? Equity, diversity, and inclusion. Drawing a direct line between scholarship, service, teaching, and community impact. Incorporating both kind of a US-based but also global perspective. That just gives you a flavor what are some of the value principles within Here and Next. So unless we also pay attention to, do faculty get any opportunity to connect their work to those value principles? Do they really matter, right? And so that's work that you're gonna do around policies related to faculty appointments and promotion and tenure. Incredibly important to really challenge us to use not only best practices, but creating opportunities where we can kind of live into our future at WashU. And so I'm super excited about the work that you're gonna do. I promise to champion it. I promise also to not be surprised if you have hard conversations, because we are at this juncture where somebody like me that has been in the academy, oh, Stephanie, dare I say it, almost 40 years, right? When you've been at this 4 decades, you think you kind of know the world of higher ed, and then you meet a new assistant professor who says, are you kidding me? I have different ambitions, I have different aspirations, the fields are changing, and maybe I'm keeping up, and perhaps I'm not. And so I encourage you, that dialogue, that grappling is really what I think you're supposed to do today. We'll be a better institution because of that. And so I'm incredibly grateful. Let me just acknowledge that before coming to Washington University, I was at New York University, so there's at least 2 colleagues in the house of an institution that I learned a lot from, and I hope that I also channeled at Washington University. So thank you all, those I know and those I don't, for coming. Stephanie, for your leadership. It's really, really important, the work that you do. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks everybody, and thanks Mary. And I'm going to keep this really short because, I mean, I knew we were going to not stick to time, but I was going to try and do so. So this event grew out of a conversation with colleagues, with Kit Wellman and Lynn Tatlock, who is here, who had been working with ACLS, and we're looking how we could leverage some of the work they've done with ACLS and the Loose Design Workshop. And one of my goals as director is to mobilize the Center for the Humanities as a space for collaboration, reflection, for promoting and sustaining the humanities and thinking about, the ways we move forward. And it seems to me that the topic we're discussing here today requires a type of urgent rethinking that the Center can and foster and support. And we're joining a conversation that has been ongoing, and I hope amplifying that conversation, begun by the ACLS, by MLA, with the guidelines on public scholarship, on how to evaluate that amongst other leadership initiatives, departments, brave and hardy departments that are out there across the country. So hopefully this will be part of that ongoing conversation. And I had 3 goals in putting this event together. How to make sure our policies keep pace with innovation. Our policies around tenure promotion. They keep pace with that goes beyond lip service in transformation and transdisciplinarity. How do we do all those things move forward as we still simultaneously strive for rigor and excellence? How do we support innovation, creativity, collaboration in humanistic scholarship, particularly in a new generation of scholars, as Mary said, who are often at the forefront of this, and to do so using the best practices of equity and access, of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And how to support and expand the future of the humanities and their necessary role in our world by reaching beyond the academy to speak to and listen to a multiplicity of publics via creativity and public and community engagement. None of this means we need to blow up our tried and tested ways of doing things. I still write articles, very infrequently now, but I'm trying. I'm still writing a monograph. But we do need to be flexible, we need to be open, we need to be nimble, and not held back by retrograde thinking of clinging to the comfort of this is the way we've always done things. I'd like to very, very quickly thank some people here, the Office of the Provost, for the sponsorship we've received from Here and Next, Kia Caldwell, who will be joining us later, Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Diversity, Mary McKay, Shalisa Holden, I'd like to thank Deanna Barch, Vice Dean for Research, for being a wonderful resource and support, as well as Feng Zhang-Hu, for the Dean of Arts and Sciences for co-sponsoring this event. Thanks so much to the Center for the Humanities, the amazing staff. Thanks to the Program and Public Scholarship, to Chris for being such a wonderful collaborator. So today we'll have 5 panels, structured around conversations and lightning round style presentations rather than formal papers. We hope to leave ample time for discussion and comments. I'd like to apologize to the people joining us on live stream that we cannot take your comments because logistically we found that to be really challenging, but please do put your comments in the chat and we'll try and address them in the kind of work that we're doing as we move forward. With Chris and I are thinking about writing an article, and I'm really interested to hear what people have to say. So I'd like to quickly introduce our guests who are assembled here, and we chose them because of their leadership roles in our academic humanities ecosystem, because of the time they've invested in doing innovative work and thinking about how to support innovative work. And I'm grateful that they were able to take time out of their busy schedules to be here. This was quite the logistical challenge, so I'm really amazed and happy that it came together. I'm keeping my bios very short because of time, but trust me, there's a lot more to be said about everybody here. I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order. Cal Alston. Cal, raise your hand, thank you. Professor in Cultural Foundations of Education, Women and Gender Studies at Syracuse University, Associate Dean for Academic Programs in the School of Education. She's a philosopher of education, currently chair of the Imagining American National Advisory Board, and the president-elect of the Philosophy of Education Society. Ulrich Baer is university professor in comparative and German literature and photography and imaging at NYU, my alma mater, where he's also the director of the Center for the Humanities and has held many leadership roles at NYU, alongside editing and authoring multiple books on topics such as poetics, modernity, photography, critical theory. He's also a fiction writer, a translator, contributor to museum catalogs, academic journals, and a creator of podcasts. Antoinette Burton is sitting right there, professor of history and the Swanlund Endowed Chair at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a widely published historian of 19th and 20th century Britain and its empire with a specialty in colonial India. In addition to her distinguished scholarships, she is the director of the Humanities Research Institute at the University of Illinois, where she's PI on a number of important grants from the Mellon Foundation, including the 16-partner consortium, the Humanities Without Walls project. Joy Connolly is a scholar of ancient Roman political thought and literature, and their enduring influence in modernity. She's authored books and many journal articles in this area. Before assuming the presidency of ACLS in 2019, she was a distinguished administrator, serving as provost and interim president of the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and a dean for the humanities at NYU. Joy was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2021. Alenda Chang is an associate professor in film and media studies at UC Santa Barbara. With a multidisciplinary background in biology, literature, and film, she specializes in merging eco-critical theory with the analysis of contemporary media. Alongside articles published in a transdisciplinary array of journals, she is also the author of Playing Nature, Ecology and Video Games. Chang is also the co-founder of the digital media studio Wireframe. Wireframe was established to support collaborative and cutting-edge research and teaching in new media with an emphasis on global human rights, social justice, and environmental concerns. Heather Hewett is a program officer for higher education initiatives, where she is working on at the ACLS, where she is working on projects that advance institutional and system-wide change grounded in justice, equity, and humanistic knowledge. Prior to joining ACLS, she served as chair and associate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the State University of New York at New Paltz. And I have to say, and Heather, I think, is on leave from her faculty job while working at ACLS, and she has been a very important collaborator in putting this event together, and I really, really thank you for all the work you did with me on this, Heather. Last but absolutely not least, Paula Krebs, a specialist in Victorian literature and culture, has been the amazing executive director of the Modern Language Association, the largest scholarly society in the humanities. Before assuming this position, Paula previously served as the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Bridgewater State University. She's written and thought about higher education and humanities issues for the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Inside Higher Ed, CNN, The Washington Post, Slate, and other publications, and is board chair of the National Humanities Alliance. Okay, so without further ado, over to Chris Schaberg, who is going to introduce the first panel and let you kind of know what we're thinking about as we move forward. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for being here today. A big thanks to Stephanie Kirk for imagining this event and making it real, as well as to the Center for the Humanities staff, Laura Perry, Meredith Kelling, who so deftly wove together this elaborate logistical web. So this first panel is called Challenges, and I just have a few thoughts before we start. For those of us who run the gauntlet of tenure and promotion, we know how rigid and sacrosanct these processes can feel. They can crush us at worst, or they can recognize and lift us up at best. Occasionally, these rituals just loom and linger, ominous thresholds in our scholarly, if still mortal, lives. Even having a full-day event dedicated to rethinking these matters is to take a risk, to open up to seeing possible alternatives. Our first panel today is on the challenges that scholars face when they attempt to undertake leading-edge work in the humanities. What is it actually like to be a scholar in a field that is nascent, or when a transdisciplinary dynamic is emerging but has not yet been validated by senior scholars or according to professional standards? When a scholar is struck with the inspiration to try a new type of output or a new creative mode or form, what institutional forces can dissuade them or hold them back? And just as important, what can mentors and leaders do to identify these challenges and to mitigate the obstacles or change the systems that uphold the status quo? How do we uphold measures of quality and rigor while staying open to innovative work that may require us to re-examine our structures of evaluation? And how do we take on challenges that are professional, subcultural, and disciplinary, inertial vestiges or entrapments that frankly only we can change? Challenges abound. But to paraphrase our old friend Michel Foucault, it's possible that these challenges may be little more than drawings in the sand ready to be washed away. So Antoinette Burton, Joy Connolly, and Alenda Chang have prepared some reflections on various challenges. After we hear from them, our other guests today, Alston, Ulrich Baer, Heather Hewett, and Paula Krebs, will offer brief responses. If we have remaining time, we'll open the floor to general questions and comments. Thanks again for being here.
So I'm going first. I imagine that what I'm about to say will sound very familiar to this group, but I have just 3 words within which to frame it. Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. If we think of leading edge work as breaking the boundaries of the single visionary scholar model even a bit, and here what I mean by that is interdisciplinary and collaborative research or arts creation, we come up against the limits of resources, staff support, and institutional flexibility in the humanities and related fields when it comes to accommodating even modestly different ways of doing work that will be recognized as legitimate for the tenure and promotion process. My data set is my own campus at Illinois and the range of projects and institutions I've been part of through the Mellon Foundation grant that I am the PI for Humanities Without Walls for 8 years. There in Humanities Without Walls, we funded 55 unique grand research challenge projects, all of which have involved interdisciplinary methods, and 12 of which have involved community and or HBCU and tribal college-based research collaborations. I'm also drawing on our 3-year initiative, Interseminars, again Mellon funded, which is fielding teams of faculty conveners and cohorts of graduate students around collaborative interdisciplinary graduate training, and I am happy to talk at length about either of those if you're interested. The infrastructural challenges include, first and foremost, getting departments to recognize and support this work at all stages, and to value it as faculty development rather than as an inconvenience or a danger to pathways to promotion. How is this infrastructural? Even getting department leaders' attention when it comes to circulating and promoting the opportunities afforded by external grant funding, attending information sessions, or when the grant is awarded, prioritizing support for the faculty seconded out of departmental work, all of that proves challenging. That is, department leaders are key players in the organizational chart, the communication stream, the tenure and promotion process, of course, and the broader culture. They aren't all powerful, and some are very sympathetic, but they are also fighting mundane fires every day, and culture change may not be on their radar or at the top of the to-do list, let alone seen as desirable in the context of local and global crises. Again, my emphasis is on collaborative work, so the second infrastructural roadblock is securing and then moving money within the university to facilitate release time or fellowship funding, or moving money beyond the university for funded projects. And above all, where public humanities is concerned, moving money into the hands of community partners who already have a deficit of trust when it comes to university partnerships. When this doesn't happen smoothly or in a timely fashion, it stops work in its tracks, takes up huge amounts of faculty and staff time, devastates under-resourced community partners, and contributes to cynicism that such work is not possible or should not be done from people in all quarters of the university and on all sides of the debate about tenure and promotion reform. This is infrastructure because what's involved falls to poorly resourced humanities departments which don't have a culture or a staff plan that supports this kind of greasing of the wheels, unlike, at least in Big Ten schools like Illinois, the sciences and engineering. Number 3 is unsurprising. What is lacking are the ways and means to represent experimental or unorthodox work and make it count in tenure and promotion materials. This includes guidelines or support that are locally generated for how to find external evaluators at peer institutions willing and able to assess new work in ways that contour to existing and even challenging expectations. And I know that Cal has a lot to say about that in a minute. This is also infrastructure because it pertains to both staff support and faculty governance. Even at Illinois, where we have a new Communication 9, which governs tenure and promotional requirements, and has introduced really great changes, there is very little infrastructure from the provost office, for example, to support faculty or EOs on how to develop new pathways. We need infrastructure to support making the case that publicly engaged work or anything that works at the boundary line of the campus and the community should count as scholarly work rather than service, and that the doing of it doesn't water down the tenure dossier. I don't think Illinois is unique. This is true even at places where tenure and promotion standards are changing. We are in the grip of a paradigm shift, and structures admittedly change slowly, but they definitely need a push. Having said all that, on the whole, those who engage in this hard work find it exhilarating and transformative, as well as a humbling and sobering and enraging experience. And there are very few humanities colleagues on campus with whom they can share their results or process the emotions with. So the failure of infrastructure also isolates, silos people who are invested in doing this work. Hopefully this is changing as more faculty prioritize research and pedagogy that moves beyond the single investigator and imagines co-creation as a value and a pleasure. Though not unique to them, these infrastructural limits can impact early career scholars of color disproportionately because of the biases they face, the particular stakes they have in the community-based research they are often doing, and the pressure to both represent and conform to standards embedded in an implicit or explicit diversity cannot coincide with excellence mentality. Yes, we have by no means laid that formula to rest, especially among senior colleagues and senior external reviewers. And this is not to say that there is any one kind of scholar who wants to do this work. But when women and BIPOC faculty want to push the boundaries of conventional scholarly method and production, they face major headwinds. The solution? Aggressive hiring of early career and some mid to later career faculty committed to this work from the start so they can build communities of inquiry and support and make noise about the combination of infrastructural limits and attitudinal indifference or hostility to new forms of humanities practice. And by the way, we don't need to displace the single monographic work. There will always be scholars and projects that require it and for which it is the best method and product. We just need to pluralize the options, even get it to 60-40 in terms of proportions. That's a modest, doable goal for the next 10 years, I think, I hope. For a longer conversation, maybe in the Q&A or over coffee, provosts need to quit the 5-year unit cyclical review and require departments to go through a theory of change exercise. Because education is a theory of change, and if we don't have one, we are sunk. Thank you.
Okay, Joy Connolly, ACLS. I like the way you started with data set. So let me explain my data set. At ACLS, we have 44 members of our Research University Consortium, and our member representatives are deans. Typically deans for humanities or deans of arts and science, so we hear from them. We have over 200 associate network members, which is a broader range, including community colleges and regional comprehensive universities, as well as research universities. And we have thousands of fellows with whom we talk. We don't talk to thousands every year, but we have thousands in the aggregate, and we talk to certainly hundreds of them every year. So we're in a really good position to have our finger on the pulse, so to speak. And this is what we hear, and we're all going to be saying much of the same thing. Only the book counts for tenure, right? The language of scholarship is not the language of my community. Why do I have to learn a new language to get recognition in academia? I get told, wait till tenure to do X, or Y, or Z. And now I'm 35 and I have a couple of kids and I'm doing my department review and I'm chairing and how do I keep up the spirit of innovation and energy? How do I do ethical engagement with community work in a time frame set by tenure when it takes years to build trust with communities that have no reason to trust me or my university? And why is it that we're living in a world where the rules set by the richest and most highly specialized universities in the world are trickling down and informing the mindsets and the aspirations of every school across the nation? So these are the people, these are the things we hear from our constituencies over and over, and especially from the emerging generation of scholars, and you're going to hear a kind of frustration, but it's positive energy, I hope, coming out of this. So 3 challenges that are pushing back against and preventing the wonderful energy and ambition, especially of the emerging scholarly generation, but not only them, especially women and people of color, not only them, but I, like Antoinette, and I expect others in this group, are especially attentive to the needs and aspirations of women and faculty of color because they've been marginalized and silenced for so long. So 3 challenges obstacles pushing back against their great energy. First of all, faculty and administrators are totally understandably and rationally afraid and angry, and especially afraid of change. It's a rational reaction because they're experiencing budget cuts, they're experiencing all kinds of increased bureaucracy, increased work, less staff. But the reaction, unfortunately, has been rigidity and resistance to change. And especially, as you said, it's resulted in the narrowing of the scope of what counts, the shape and the form of the content of scholarship. And I want to say this cuts both ways because I mentioned community engaged scholarship a few minutes ago, but so kind of on the left conceptually, on the intellectual spectrum in academia, but it affects people on the so-called right, and I hate to say this, I disavow it. Delete from tape. But it's the way, I guess the reason I want to be honest about it is I think it is the way it's talked about in the academy. So when I think about the academic right coming out of a discipline I'm trying to change the name of, classical studies, foundational research like textual criticism or papyrology. I mean, people in academia do talk about that as a kind of right-ish work, conservative work. So I don't want to sweep that under the rug. That's why it emerged in my language. But the point is that that this narrow lens through which, or narrow gateway through which we're trying to push scholars doesn't allow for textual criticism or papyrology or archival work or quantitative digital work or archaeological method work. Just as it also doesn't allow for public writing and podcasts and community engaged work and scholar activism. So it really is a broad spectrum of work that's getting squeezed out. So I'll say that the fear and anger, which is legitimate, and that's, again, I'm trying to be honest about this as and foreground it because it's real. It isn't fantasy, and we somehow have to combat it or take it on if we want to change the system. That fear and anxiety of faculty and administrators. Second, more briefly, I see a refusal to acknowledge the time required to do work, to mount non-traditional projects and to follow up on them, and especially to embed the impacts of the new kinds of knowledge creation or old kinds of knowledge creation that aren't represented in the curricula, both undergraduate and doctoral. And all of this takes time and it's not rewarded. But it too is the work of circulating knowledge. And so it's got to be part of the system, and it is absolutely not part of the reward system, I mean. Thirdly, honestly, and I will just take a minute to say, the question I think is really, for me, not what needs to change, it's really how. And I'll just remind us all that in a brilliant paper by Tim Eatman and Julie Ellison on public scholarship, if you haven't read it, it's downloadable. If you just Google Julie Ellison and Tim Eatman and public scholarship, you'll find it. That report came out in 2008, and it was based on work done in 2004, 5, 6. This is 20 years ago, okay? And that report, they say, it was already old, like an old debate of how we update. So how do we move from the painfully slow boring of hard boards, as Baer said, to system-wide change? And I think we need faculty buy-in, we need agreed on benchmarks across groups, and maybe we start with AAC&U or APLU or CCAS or some kind of associative network. We need a plan and a timeline for effective cross-institutional networks. We need plugs from university and college leadership. We need more systematic help for faculty, as you were saying, with non-traditional profiles, in particular coming up for PNT. But I mean, I could go on, and we'll talk about opportunities in the next panel. But I'll just say that we can do it with faculty and buy-in and an excitement about a new future, a new academy. And I'll just use as my final example. I think Richard Aram is one of the co-authors of Academically Adrift. It's a controversial book for many of us, but he points to the SAT as proof. If he says, if you think higher ed can't change, you know, the SAT, like California system bought into it in 1960, and by 1980, everybody was obsessed with the SAT, from admissions to rankings people to administrators, students to parents to all the people who made money off SAT prep companies. So that's not a positive example, maybe, but it is proof that systemic change is possible, and we can do it, and we can do it this way. We can do it this time around, but we've got to acknowledge the obstacles that I mentioned. So I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, I think it's me, and then we get response. So I'm definitely taking a perspective that's a little bit more bottom up, because I don't have nearly the amount of administrative chops as everybody on this panel. So I kind of will give you some more personal stories of how this has affected my own kind of journey through tenure, and I'm beyond it now by a good time, but it's more recent for me. And I think this will overlap with what you've already said. So the first challenge I wanted to talk about was the disdain in the academy for multiple or collaborative authorship, and it's already been hit on. But obviously we have a preference for solo authored monographs and articles, but there's still a lingering disdain for things like edited collections, or even, I think as a real test case, is anonymous authorship, which I've seen in a couple of my, I will give you some examples. So, and this is, we could look over at the sciences and their culture of multiple authorship, which has its own problems with the sort of lead author and the, subsequent ordering, but it's definitely an attempt to be more inclusive. And I think this is important because many, at least, innovative projects like digital humanities and other things are very collaborative, and they require teams of individuals with very different skill sets that are complementary. And so, I have seen colleagues who have actually struggled with the tenure process because their book authorship was a multiply authored book. I have also had colleagues that have been part of collectives that publish anonymously as collectives. And I think this is a question of whether they were pre or post tenure, whether that was possible. And in my own experience, and I had this where I worked with a student who, a graduate student advisee of mine, who we made a video game together that was about wildlife mitigation techniques. I know it sounds great. And I went to write an article about the process of making it, and wanted to list the graduate student as a co-author, but it was nigh impossible in the sort of run-up to tenure to do that. And then after achieving tenure, I also invited somebody to co-author something with me, and in the process of writing that piece, my co-author actually passed away. And it was still just a cloud document of notes. And at that point I had tenure, and I could say I'm keeping the name on this piece because it's important to me. But previous to that, I think I would have had a much more difficult decision, right? Because I wrote the piece based off of these notes. So I just put that out there because these are actual decisions that I found myself having to wrestle with. And maybe wasn't most comfortable for me. And I think co-authorship, it's not just because of collaboration on projects, but also because I think a lot of people I talk to say that co-authorship, especially later in their careers, is one of their most generative forms of scholarship. It's when you have a way of keeping yourself growing and broadening your horizons, and maybe also forging the necessary cross-disciplinary links to expand your field, not only your own scholarship, and also because ethical research practices now extend to sharing authorship with the communities that you work with. So whether it's stewards of traditional ecological knowledge or tech, or I've been told recently by a senior scholar that there's a new paper that actually credits the land as the first author.
Wow.
And I didn't find it, but it's very fascinating to me. And I work in environmental humanities, so this is very interesting to me. So co-authorship, this is one huge thing. And I would just say the last thing is that co-authorship seems like to some senior scholars that it's like a lazy way out, but actually it's more work to have to work with somebody.
Yes.
Everybody's nodding, right? You integrate your style and do justice to your perspectives, and that is the second bone that I was going to pick, which was that double the work, not double the fun, unlike the Doublemint ads of the 80s, if anyone's old enough. I was like, it's double the chewing, but not double your pleasure. And then this came to me because I myself do it, and a lot of people I know straddle the theory-practice divide. And even when I was an undergraduate and I did a senior thesis project at Cornell where I made a 25-minute documentary, and you know that's a huge amount of work, they've made me write a paper too. And so ever since then, I've just nursed this little chip on my shoulder about if you do creative work, you have to do double the work, essentially.
Yeah.
Not only do the work, but you also have to do the work of making it legible and proving that you can also do the other stuff. And so I just see so many people kind of stuck in this process. Like I run my lab with a colleague who hosts the largest Arabic Twitter database for other researchers to use. But tech moves so fast that she has to update it every 2 or 3 years and basically build the platform anew. But on your BioBib or whatever your thing for your institution, it just looks like the same thing. It's like a new version, right? Like, what's the big deal? Right? So just thinking about this kind of the additional work that has to be done. Yeah, I think that's mostly what I was going to say. And then just saying, I think I've been involved with this process for DH projects, and as long as we can set standards or have evidence of peer review, whether it's through juried exhibition or curatorial selection, or catalog entries written by scholars, that kind of thing, I think that maybe eliminate this double standard of double work. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, I just, if you might as well go.
Yeah, let's just go on
Okay.
down the. Sorry, we're trying to figure out how much time do we have? We don't know. We're just making this up as we go.
Yeah, we are. We're just making it up. You got till 10:30.
Yeah, we
We
plenty of
have
time.
as much time as we want.
We have plenty of time. So yeah, let's just go along the way, and then we'll open it up and we have some remarks.
I was just going to say, as far as challenges go, I was surprised not to hear more about assessment and evaluation as the big challenge. And so one thing that I would like to surface in addition to a more direct attention on that is what that brings up for us in terms of institutional versus other structures in relation to the work we're talking about. So where is accreditation in this, where national organizations came up, Joy mentioned them, but I feel like one set of challenges is the U.S. university system and in relation to accreditation and in relation to campus autonomy.
I just want to reflect that
Antoinette and I were colleagues for 16 years at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, so when she mentioned communication number 9, I kind of choked. But I do actually want to reflect back on that, because I got tenure in 1995, and even though people in the university community aren't supposed to tell you how you did in the room, somebody did tell me that I was the first dossier that they'd seen where there was a refusal to say, this is scholarship, this is teaching, this is service. And so I guess I was destined to move on in that space. And I was a drama student, which is a cross-disciplinary activity, philosophy of ed and cultural foundations of ed, and women and gender studies. Part of what I did at Illinois when I was head of women's studies was meet with African American studies and the other cross-disciplinary groups to help junior scholars become more legible to their senior colleagues. And Antoinette was in the history department. We had many discussions because we had some allies in there, but there was still, I mean, I'm old enough to know when Signs was the only feminist journal that you could publish in and get any form of recognition. And so starting there, we had to say, you have to make the field legible as you're building it. It's a very challenging piece. But I will say my optimism, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, is that people have been doing that, and I didn't make my dossier to be that way. My senior colleagues did, and so I think that's a reflection of what's needed. Senior colleagues have to be more flexible. That isn't how they did their work, but they could recognize and help me make legible the work that I was doing.
Maybe I can build on that, Cal. So, I mean, I have so many things I'm just learning. I just would love you to keep on talking. I'll just write it down. So I was in the provost office for 11 years, so I oversaw all the tenure and promotion documents for all the schools except the sciences. And 3 things I thought. To demystify the tenure process is crucially important. And what you just said, I set up a reverse mentoring program at NYU. At the end had 90 faculty, 45 junior faculty, almost all underrepresented in their respective fields, which was women in philosophy, underrepresented scholars of color in all sorts of fields, but the mentoring was reverse mentoring for the senior people. So, and it's from corporate law, it's sort of, there's a model to do it, but it was really meant because what I saw is like, well, the people in charge happen to look a lot like me, and actually had no idea, and had never been in rooms with 12 women of color who said, this is my experience at NYU, and since they were not the majority, they actually just listened. And they said to me afterwards, I'd never been in a room, and I said, well, I can't help your life, but I can make this happen. But the reverse mentoring was essential that the junior faculty actually got to be in a safe space, and we structured it in a way that they got a research stipend, so they had to meet with their senior mentor once a semester and say, how am I using this money? To go to a conference, transcribe data, whatever. So there was a kind of technical piece that meant they had to meet. This was essential because the people who were chairs, deans, etc., learned a lot and realized we are actually sticking to these old criteria, not because they were recalcitrant and obstinate, but they actually didn't really know. And they need to learn from junior scholars. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I think teaching is usually totally disregarded in tenure evaluations. And a part of what I heard here from Antoinette, sort of support for faculty, release time from Joy also, I think teaching can be a conduit to actually allow people to see more of this innovative scholarship in a different way. So if you're a department chair, undergraduate studies person, and you're teaching from the junior faculty done in this way, you start to realize, oh, this is how they're doing it. And the second part of the teaching is that teaching is very hard to set up in many universities. Team teaching is really difficult at my institution, NYU, because of the financial silos. Not at all departmental, institutional, people who love to work together, but the student tuition stays in respective schools. So I think team teaching has to be structured in a way that allows all this collaborative work, but when teaching leads, at least in an institution such as NYU, which is tuition dependent, if teaching leads, a lot of other things will follow, because they start to realize, oh, we have 2 faculty, but even if you're setting up a new school for public health here, if the team teaching isn't structured, that faculty can just step into it, and the system is there and say, I want to work with that person in that other school, and it's set up in a way. And the last thing I thought, that demystifying the tenure process, And the mentoring up to tenure is really hard, I think, because people, as you said, they're sort of, it's such an intimidating process, and it's said to be this kind of gatekeeping. So they need to be matched with people who are just a little bit ahead of them, and then very senior people, but not with very senior people who've had this behind them and say, oh, it'll be fine, you'll get it. They have to be with somebody who's just gone through it, and as we've seen, those people, especially for women actually at NYU, they actually tend to stay at that associate level for far too long. They actually get tenure, and the process was so grueling that something doesn't happen after that. So I would think if teaching becomes a driver of this kind of change, it will also do something to what you talked about, and in some ways what Alenda talked about, like the single author monograph can be undone in a certain way when teaching is undone. Then when you're realizing you're actually working with somebody constantly, you're producing material, you co-own these things, the university gets used to that. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thanks, go ahead.
So just picking up on the thoughts about teaching, it seems to me that we're at this really interesting moment with teaching, undergraduates in particular, where I have seen some of my colleagues who are doing incredibly interesting work that is taking the classroom in new directions, thinking outside of traditional assignments, ungrading the whole bit. And then I see some colleagues who are almost doubling down, right, on writing essays, what are we going to do about AI, this narrowing of focus. And so I wonder to what extent some of that is not connected to the fear, Joy, that you were talking about, because I think the fear around loss is also fear that our culture is shifting and the students in our classrooms are different. And some of them, at least in my experience, are not as capable of reading books. And what are we to do about that, right? So I think that the fear and the clinging to is connected to larger cultural shifts. And so this thinking about how teaching can maybe be part of the problem, but also part of the solution is a really interesting provocation. I had the benefit when I was teaching at New Paltz in gender studies that our intro class was team taught. And we just had that structure because we were an interdisciplinary program at our founding, and we had retained that structure incredibly so. We still keep on wondering when the institution will take it away from us, right? Because it is more expensive. But it has been one of my favorite things about being a professor, and the students have always benefited, right? And it's been a reason why I've collaborated with colleagues on articles. It's really been generative for so much collaboration. So I think that there's such an opportunity and so many interesting experiments happening around teaching, right? It doesn't have to be team taught. I had recently went to IA where I saw people doing all kinds of different innovations. So I think linking those experiments to what people are producing and how we're valuing them is important. The last thing I'll just say, as someone who comes from a student campus, there is this overlay in some systems, right, of system. We actually call it system. But I know that there are other systems that are also addressing this. So I know the University of California system has a collaboration where different schools are talking about these issues related to trying to expand out what counts. So I think that those are particular challenges, but not impossible. I do think this idea of coming together, collaboration across institutions and across locations and disciplines is central to this work.
Add one thing to Antoinette, you said about release time. I think it's really tricky that universities treat release time as this amazing gift you get from the ACLS or something, and it's this huge reward for tenure track. The cost is carried by adjunct faculty who have to step in and teach for really no pay at all. And somehow there's this enormous value, and even in your evaluations, if you said them used to be got a grant, didn't teach, that looks really good.
Yep.
And that's actually not really how it should work, and somehow we should rethink, and especially when people get a grant, that a lot of times deans are then stuck to say, oh, Professor so-and-so got a great grant, so who's going to teach your class now? And the dean is sitting there thinking, I have to now scramble, find some person. There's something wrong about the way we talk about it, I think, and that is a cultural shift. That's not an institutional only, but the way we talk about release time is like, oh, thank God I'm off. It's a terrible thing to hear from people who teach, I think. And that is, but it's built into the structure of actually the whole evaluation process.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Go
Can
ahead.
I pick up on it, because I just want to pull together a thread and also acknowledge, because some people are here, when we got a grant from Luce to do the design workshop for a new academy, which was online because it was during the pandemic, collection of 6 schools, teams from 6 schools, including WashU. And the key was, and this is the thread, was intergenerational conversation. And one of the things we realized was that the university doesn't make space in any of its structures for deep, sustained intergenerational, and I should say also cross-sector. And I'm sorry if I sound like a marketing consultant, but intergenerational and multi-sector serious conversations that go on to changing, to be policy changing. So I mean, and I'm really thinking about the teaching. I think you're really onto something in thinking about teaching as a leading leading point of the wedge, because bringing together we didn't have undergraduates, unfortunately, in the design workshop. We have graduate students though, but undergraduates, graduate students, people off the tenure track, adjuncts, chairs, deans. Those are the people who made up minus undergrads the design workshop, and that the generative thinking really happened there, and the educational awareness happened there. So now we've just made it more complicated, because not only do we have to work across universities and colleges, but in some kind of network, because higher education is, as a colleague of mine used to love to say, it's a system. It's not a system when you need it to be a system, and when you don't want it to be a system, it's a system. That's higher ed. So we have to build across institutions, but also within them, drawing on the ideas and energy and creativity and desires and changes that, the changes that especially the emerging generation are coping with. So that intergenerational thread was what I was, as the locus of change. Just want to pull that out as a thread I heard.
So one other thread perhaps is the political economy of labor here, and the teaching release question is obviously vexed because it touches on the casualization of labor and who pays the price for that, which is also an important pain point in this revolutionizing how we think. Who are the knowledge makers? The people doing the most innovative teaching and sometimes research are actually the casualized, the non-tenure track. And many faculty really want to draw a bright line between themselves as first-class citizens and non-tenure track, whatever you call them locally, labor. On the other hand, the science professors don't teach nearly as much as the humanities professors. So in a Big Ten institution like mine, where we have, I think, God, not for the tape, but I think we have one of the highest, most amounts of the money from the NSF and all the rest, and all kinds of people who are producing fabulous science that makes headlines and policy changes don't actually teach. So in that context, the question may be asked, why is that asymmetry happening, and how does that impact the prestige economy that we're all working in, gasping after, and is very differential across the Big Ten. So, and staff labor in humanities, arts, and related fields departments is also very different than in departments of chemistry. And the kind of infrastructure the material infrastructure that supports the kind of labor that scientists want to do, I think is really distinctive. And of course, and then I'll stop, in the wake of 2008, the big budget cuts, at least in Illinois and another Big Ten university, we've not recovered from that. We're only just recovering from the stripping out of so many bodies to do the labor. So I think those things are really important to keep in mind.
Some questions or thoughts from the audience?
I have one. I appreciated your comment about the lack of separation between teaching and research. And I'm kind of wondering how you did that.
It wasn't on purpose. I didn't know it was a thing.
But I mean, these things should be integrated, and sometimes the teaching is where the scholarship is born, and there is some kind of interaction going on there. But certainly in most institutions, including this one, there's this category, that category, and that category. So,
well,
what was your
I would not talk about Illinois there. I'd talk about Syracuse,
yes,
because, like Uli, I was the person responsible for reading all the tenure dossiers for 10 years in the provost's office. And when we rewrote the tenure rules, one of the things we made a provision for was something called an integrated dossier. Part of that was to get away from calling publicly engaged scholarship service. But it was meant to, and we also had people who were doing things like teaching, not on load, but using their teaching in the community, teaching in writing centers, teaching in prisons, that those spaces, even though they were not teaching our students, they were teaching. It was, and it was creating opportunities for our students to expand their portfolio. And so we had successful, again, had to sort of help the first people to do it and have, again, senior people in their units who were going to advocate for it, who were going to support them and make clear to their colleagues why this was just as valuable work. I mean, it wasn't like they weren't writing articles or doing other things, but that this sort of vast array of work was connected and organic and was contributing to both the knowledge economy outside, but inside the university as well. I mean, I think part of it is, and again, you know, every day we can read an article about the crisis in humanities, blah, blah, blah. But part of it is that we haven't been aggressive enough about saying what the value is, and that includes saying it to our students. Because if they don't have a great experience in an English class or something, then the value seems to be disconnected from the values of life. So to the extent that people, and not everybody has to do everything, but for somebody who has a way of winding that together, we had it in the writing program, we had it in the our journalism school in Newhouse. It's people who, that was their world. They were doing practice and teaching and scholarship that was very much bound together. So I think it's finding the right people and the right circumstances for that. And not everybody's going to want to do it or should do it.
Thank you.
Mel?
Hey, thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful. And I apologize because this isn't really a question for any one of you in particular. But I was wondering, I also don't know whether this is for challenges or opportunities, but here we go. I wonder, like, what do you think is the relationship between the reform of P&T for faculty at the faculty level and the reform of doctoral education for folks who were just grad students and are now junior faculty, right? Like, is this a sort of like trickle down process, a sort of trickle up, you know, we sort of move people in process? Is it impossible to think about one process without also thinking about the other at the same time? Okay, that's an easy yes, I guess, yeah. But I just sort of wondering whether are you thinking about this at the I'm in DGS and English here also, I'll put my card on the table, but is this a process where, you know, you sort of have to think about one at the same time as we're thinking about the other? Do you think about it as a problem for P&T or an opportunity for the future of P&T?
Can I just talk from the disciplinary association perspective? So I remember years ago going to an event at the Simpson Center at the University of Washington where they were talking about the alternate training they were doing for graduate students to prepare them for other kinds of careers than higher ed. And it turned out that all of that training was really useful for higher ed as well, right? So that their students got jobs at a higher rate when they knew about the world outside of, you know, 18th century poetry. Because undergraduate institutions especially valued that kind of training and perspective. And so when we ran the Connected Academics program, a series of pro seminars for graduate students and site visits and internships and whatnot, those students actually ended up getting academic jobs at a higher rate than normal. This was not what we were aiming at, but it's because institutions increasingly recognize that we are not trained in graduate school to prepare our undergraduates for life after graduation. And that the more we train graduate students to understand the world outside of higher ed, the better they are at working with undergraduates, the better they are then at recruiting undergraduates into the humanities because they understand what the value of a humanities degree. So it's a lovely little cycle if it works.
Yeah. But the dissertation is still immovable.
That's
the thing. That's the same way we're talking about the book as the immovable thing, and it's where conversation about doctoral reform circles and dies, right? So,
Well, I was going to talk about this in opportunities, but I'll talk about it now. The example I was going to use was A.D. Carson, who's a very good friend of mine at University of Virginia. They founded a department for his work. His dissertation was a long-form rap album, and he, in 2022, had the first recording published by University of Michigan Press as a peer-reviewed artifact. And so I just say, yes. Is he in like a weird anomaly that I have to bring up every time I talk about different forms of Sure. But we also have graphic novels, and we've published stuff on podcast dissertation. And so I think that they're, again, the first person who does it has to do it at such a high level that people do not just dismiss it. But it is being done, and it can be done, and I always tell my students, even if they're writing a long-form dissertation, do not give me a 5-chapter bloody thing with a long lit review. Blah! Don't bore me! Bring it!
And I think this is the point, Mel, that the two things are so connected, and people keep asking me, well, why are you not going to talk about dissertations in this? And of course we are talking about it now. But they're part of the same ecosystem. You can't separate them out. And I think just for the sake of kind of coherence, we focus this, and this really isn't just about tenure and promotion. I mean, that's a framing device. And so I think, this is all part of the same thing. How can we encourage our graduate students to do really beyond the one novel per chapter dissertation, which I will shoot myself if I ever have to read one of those again. How do we then say, don't produce that, but then you've got to get a job, and then you come into the academy as someone who's written this hybrid or exciting dissertation, but no, you must produce a monograph. So all these things are deeply connected. And I know, Lynn, that you have been thinking about this a lot, because my predecessor, Jean Ullman, won a huge Mellon to redefine a doctoral education, and one of the things that we've been doing in this phase of it is reaching out to departments like African and African American Studies and German and what's it called now? The
comparative literature thought.
Yeah, it's a new department, but to people who we think are who are really thinking about these things and trying to give them funds to support it. And I know Lynn has been really thinking about this, to your point, Mel. And we're happy for you to help you think through that. So with our Mellon money.
So what did you call that English? Reverse mentoring? I think is key here.
Yeah, because we need to learn from what our graduate students are doing, what they want to do, and not gatekeep them into these really terrible boxes. But unless we have the infrastructure that Antoinette is talking about, then anything is just running on a hamster wheel. The infrastructure is the key piece.
I just want to make it even harder by saying it's also graduate admissions. Because when I worry sometimes when I talk to deans who say, or faculty who say, well, we're going to wait until the junior faculty member has that brilliant, incredibly well done project, to come knocking at the door, and then we'll try our best to help them get tenure. And I'm like, why are you expecting masses of people when you yourself are selecting people who do work pretty much like you? And I'll just share, I was talking about this last night at dinner. I mean, these affinities and attachments run so deep, and they're so emotional, and they're so bound up with our love for what we do. And I still remember, it was at NYU, a seminar, I was teaching a grade seminar class of about 30 people, and a student asked me, this is 15 years ago, a student asked me if he could submit a video instead of a paper, and I laughed. And I wasn't mean. I was like, he was a good student, but I was like, oh, you gotta be kidding, And I didn't give it a second of thought. I was just not there yet. And he was like, oh, well, I thought it'd be interesting, but he was such a nice student, a good guy. He said, okay, I see, I'll write a paper. But the reason I tell this anecdote is not only to remind myself how ashamed I am of that moment, but also that you can grow, because I changed. But he fell off my list of people I would recommend to go to graduate school in that moment. And that I didn't really realize until a little later. But that's exactly the kind of thinking we need to bring into the academy, people thinking outside the box, and instead we still evaluate in so many fields, in so many departments, who can write a good seminar paper in their application so that they can get in and write a good dissertation, so they can get the monograph and get tenure, because we want them to be set up for success. So it really goes all the way back to graduate admissions and undergraduate teaching, and that's what makes this such a wicked problem, because it's so interconnected.
We have 2 questions here, 2 questions here, 3, and we're really good to say something. So, I want to start over here with Joe, and then move around just because you were waiting.
Well, mine's rather small. I want to go back to Ulrich's remark about the business of leaves and the question of the making up of the teaching, and the fact that we don't think about it, and it contributes to the denigration of teaching as a constituent of tenure. And everyone nodded, I nodded, and then I wondered, is this anything more than a rhetorical problem, that we should speak more respectfully of teaching? And I'm just checking.
Yeah.
Because the nodding suggested that, yes, we have to deal with this, and I didn't know whether the dealing is merely
So, for example, so when I was in administration, we actually never said there's a teaching load. It's a teaching schedule. And so I was in senior administration. I taught every semester, partly to retain the modicum of credibility I'd left, which is very, very paltry. But somehow when you speak to faculty and you say, oh, in my class, it shifts everything. They say, in my class, I heard. They were also my control group, because I thought I was actually working for students, and I had always 18 students in front of me. But I think this integration is actually, it's both cultural and it's systemic. And what you're saying, there's no thought to it, really. It's like, oh, someone gets a leave, fantastic, let's reward this person on their track to success. And the people who are backfilling
Are getting
casual labor are actually screwed even more in a way. And so I think it's really a systemic thing to think about, and to also kind of reward time off inherently, which is also the logic of huge grants. You get a huge grant, then you get another huge grant because you had the previous huge grant. And so there's something here, I think, that's more than just, and it's more than cultural, but cultural is essential. So I'm not saying it's either or, I think both have to happen.
But can I say a question? So, as I think Antoinette said, there's lots of science departments where teaching load is lower, and yet students want to go and learn in those spaces, and so my question is really, like, instead of thinking everybody has to teach all the time, should we also think that we should reward those who teach more and be more, it's not just something that falls on them, but it actually is an invitation to be a central part of the enterprise of the university. And I know many of us have teaching faculty, full-time teaching faculty now and things like that, but there's still second class.
It's very hard. When I looked at dossiers for tenure, so a serious tenure case out in it was this thick, and I would disregard the 60% because it was countless, literally hundreds of teaching evaluations that was Xerox, and I thought, I have no ability to assess any of this, so I would disregard it entirely. And I won a teaching award, which was really prestigious. I was super happy at junior faculty, and one of the deans, who's a friend of ours, said, well, now we can't count teaching against you. And I repeated this to the former president, John Sexton, who repeated it in every single meeting. I said, I wish I'd never said it. But he put his finger on something correct. He said, otherwise teaching can be used against you, but it will never work in your favor. So all of this, and the sciences I don't know, at NYU, like those people are my heroes who teach 800 students twice a week at 8 in the morning, organic chemistry. That's like, so they teach all, it depends, who you're talking about in the sciences. We have research scientists who don't teach at all, different classification, but we also have people who teach. So I think that's just part of the whole bigger question of evaluation.
I just wanted to follow up on some of the things we talked about in terms of the challenges and the kind of ethical implications, but also the time implications of teaching differently. So I was one of the grantees of the Studio Lab grant with a colleague, Schaberg, an African American Studies, we had the Studio Lab for a year. It's a graduate course, Public Humanities, which involved a lot of cooperation with community partners. It was great. I have a hard time coming back to the regular class.
It was an amazing class.
And we all loved it, and I think the students really benefited. But there's two things I keep thinking about, and I don't really know what to make of it. On one hand, that kind of teaching is much more involved in terms of time.
Yeah.
In a way that you prepare the class, that's one thing, but there's a lot of after-hour events, meeting with community partners, managing the students in a very different way, who are very different project and skills that they need to learn, and they need a different kind of mentoring that is more time consuming, I felt like, than going into the classroom twice a week. But it all, on the other hand, also came at the expense of my research. And now I feel like I'm done with the Studio Lab. Now I really have to focus on getting my monograph done because I don't want to wait to be promoted to full for another 2 years. Right? So it's kind of, it's this very involved teaching, which I really enjoyed, really loved, and the students really benefited in terms of graduate education. But now I feel like I need to switch gears. And I'm abandoning my community partners, for one, where we've built really exciting relationships that could continue and should continue on to really make good on the public humanities that we want to pursue. But I also know that if I want to advance my career, I need to step back from that and write my book, which is what I'm trying to do now. I want a research fellowship and I'm abroad to focus on working on my own work, but it feels like I should do either or. So to not do X, Y, Z until tenure, it just keeps going in the next career stage. And I feel like that's something that institutions kind of need to also grapple with, is to open up what we can do and what we're encouraged to do at all stages in our career, and not make a choice between either or, because I feel like that's, and I don't think that's just my own personal experience, but I'm trying to come to grips with what the impact of that was. So it kind of speaks to a lot of the things you have already mentioned, but I feel like there's a larger conversation we need to kind of have.
And I think reflecting maybe somewhat, Annika, on that experience would be really useful because these classes were designed using Mellon money and they come with a nice budget. But when we've put out the call for people to pitch these classes, we don't get that many because it's an incredibly exciting opportunity, but it's a lot of work and we offer support, the center staff offer an enormous amount of support, but it's on top of everything else. So it's innovative teaching. I talk to students from that class all the time. I mean, they're just blown away. But how do you sustain that? You know, is that, you know, so Liz, I think, wanted to say something.
Okay, Liz, and then.
Yeah, I'll try and make it brief, but it draws on your experience and it touches on someone said, why aren't we talking about assessment more?
Yes.
And as a full professor who often gets asked to write letters around the country, usually they come with the proviso, don't talk about the teaching. And we want just the scholarship, we don't want to hear about the teaching. I just got 2 requests like that from 2 IB institutions. And fundamentally, what we're talking about is finding a way where we bring those back. And if you actually are a scholar in the field and you see how they're teaching the material and how they're shaping it, it can be one of the things you address. And so there's many things about the assessment process, and I'll just throw this out here. Why can't some of them be associate professors, who I think have a lot to offer about the future of the field? Why can't some of them be emeriti, who are often the most productive scholars with a long view and can write a really smart evaluation? And no, you don't want all 3, 6, 9, 12, however many. You don't want all of them to come from the same field, but what if we diversified that? And we had people who could speak to the teaching from multiple levels, and the community partner could be taken seriously, not as the add-on, not as the person who adds the 13th letter, because it'd be nice to hear from them, but that person counts as much. And everybody is writing to the letters. Once people get going, they're worried about what the letter writers will say. And if we can somehow shift that culture, I have a colleague who shall go unnamed, but who was devastated when they saw the recent evaluations because so many people in their field are emeriti. And the person said, I'm screwed. There's no one who's going to be able to write well. I think we have to recognize the humanities are often very small fields with a limited range of scholars at the institutions the committee would want to hear from. And I think we need to open up and diversify the letter writers to be able to get a more complete picture of the exciting potential of an Annika, whose teaching should be taken so seriously as she goes up for promotion. So I want to hear more about evaluation and assessment.
Just saying something back to you. I think part of that is what I was going to talk about, but I'll talk about it now, is that assessment network is a networked activity, and we tend to view it as like, you know, I know when I went up, I was like, does that person like me? Should I put them on my list? Do they talk to me at the conference? And it just gets into this like personality thing, which it most of the time is not. But I read a lot of letters for people who do public scholarship who are not doing philosophy of education or women's studies or anything like it, but it's because of my role in Imagining America, people came to know that I could assess their work more broadly. And I think we need to build more networks of people who are both able and willing to go beyond. If we're going to encourage people to go beyond their disciplinary boundaries, we have to include people. I think also when institutions say they have to be full professors from peer institutions, that's just asking for trouble. So I agree. I think, you know, you want to have, and I will say when we said we need to include, for people who are doing public scholarship, they have to include outside of academic voices. You need to teach people how to write good letters, because otherwise you will get a letter that says, so-and-so was super nice, worked well with our staff. Right. We did it in the art school and other places. And so we developed letters that were being very specific about what expertise we thought they could bring to the assessment. We gave them some language around what we were going to be evaluating, and we got great letters from those partners who've invested all this time working with people, and maybe talking about teaching and not necessarily.
Maybe we can develop those letters for faculty as well.
Yeah.
And I would just add, can I just add that I am an associate still, and I have been asked to do quite a few tenure reviews and even promotions to full, because my discipline is so young that I am the best they can get right now in terms of seniority. So that it is context specific.
Yeah, well that suggests that humanities could have slightly different criteria than the scientists in enormous fields where finding 10 full professors in peer institutions is not a challenge. Right. But I think we are a different animal. We do, and that has to be known by the administration. Yeah.
Hello. So I wanted to touch on a few things. I work in the Provost's office, so I really appreciated what you said about the Provost's office, Antoinette, in terms of making, I think you said making departments do away with the 5-year review model and move toward a theory of change model. So I have a few comments, but I was wondering if you could say more about that. I also wanted to just put a pin in the fact that the whole phrase, "would this person get tenure at your institution," is problematic and not a best practice. And it's something Carrie-Ann O'Meara, we had her here back in the spring, she talks about, right? Because that's a whole different ecosystem, right? And so I think what keeps us bound to the monograph, I'm an anthropologist by training, but what keeps us bound to the monograph, I think, is this fear that people won't get good outside reviews also. And so we need to talk about the criteria in our department or our school for tenure as opposed to how you define it elsewhere. And the last thing, I was really intrigued by the reverse mentoring and the intergenerational dialogues, because that's something that we're thinking about doing here, because I think a lot about our senior faculty as, well, you know, how can we get them involved and to help them understand the experiences of younger faculty, which are so different. I mean, the millennial kind of worldview and so forth. And so I would love to hear more about that if you have one to share.
I'll just pick up on one thing you said before theory of change, which is that I mentioned faculty governance in my remarks and as a dimension of the infrastructure. And I don't know here at Washington University, whether all the criteria are written out at the department level. But that is a faculty governance question. And at Illinois, in the history department, when we revised our criteria for promotion to full, we sampled 20 examples of what people were doing nationally in history to cobble together what we thought was, and so I think that that kind of labor is really important and can bubble up to the provost as well as down in the communication situation. very quickly, theory of change, as many of you may know, is something that NGOs often use to help them coordinate effort for the most impactful outcomes, usually around social justice questions. And I've had some experience with this because we built in some paid evaluation for our Mellon grants. And it basically is a team building experience which asks you to nominate what your goal is. In one sentence, by the way, we were like, do we have two sentences? No. We have a compound sentence, so I can't. And then it's a three-part thing beyond the goal, which is what are the operations that inform a goal, what are the objectives that are underneath the goal, and what are the middle rank operations or conceptual frames that bring everything all together, and each one of those, potentially, if you want it, generates indicators, aka metrics, but you don't have to think of it that way. And team building around that decision making is really important. The strategic filters that produces around what change you're wanting is really critical, and it's very culturally it doesn't match with the university. I mean, it's cringe-making for so many people, but it's so valuable. And I'm sorry, the 5-year review, which says we need to hire another person in 18th century poetry, you are never going to get out of that cycle. And not saying theory of change is the only way, but it's one way.
So you weren't talking about the tenure promotion cycle. It was the planning cycle for you.
Culture change.
Okay.
Yeah. Was it really going to respond to?
Yeah.
I just want to speak to what you said about the culture of leave, because I feel like when you say that, on the one hand I say, yeah, on the other hand I say, well, why are people, even people who love to teach, so incredibly relieved when they have time off? And why are they spending all of this time when they have no time at all to apply for grants so that they can get that time off? So it seems to me that, one thing I haven't really heard is, yes, you want people to do all this amazing scholarship and amazing teaching, but the teaching loads are so burdensome that even people who love to teach often get burned out long before the career is over. Or, so I'm someone who's actually not in academia. I have a PhD in history, but I wanted to do public-facing work, and this was like in the mid-90s, so it just didn't look like it was going to be possible for me. So I made a choice not to go into academia, but one of the main reasons I made that choice is because when I looked at my friends, they were spending all of their time teaching. And it was pretty clear to me that I was not the kind of person who can work 18 hours a day, and that I was going to be spending 90 to 100% of my time teaching during the times when I didn't have any leave. So those kind of really burdensome teaching loads, which are not true in the sciences, right? In general, they tend to be much higher. I think they prevent people like me from staying in academia. And I think it's a really serious issue, which is obviously bound up with a lot of other things, like all the new software programs that require academics to do all their own admin, and make it much more efficient for the people at top who are making the money and much less efficient for everybody else, right? But it's tied up with a lot of economics and things that are difficult to shift, but I would just say I think teaching loads have to be a part of this conversation, because people like me, aren't going to stay in academia if we're facing those kinds of teaching loads, and I'm someone who likes to teach.
We don't select for, I think one of the reasons faculty find teaching so hard is we don't select for graduate school people who are good teachers, right? So they're overcoming psychological barriers and often, the whole shebang, and then they're not rewarded for it anyway. So there's every reason not to care about it and to think of teaching as a burden and not as an opportunity.
I'm glad this is coming up actually,
Yeah.
because my second point about double the work was really about, my fear is that these conversations about making other kinds of work more legible is actually just going to lead to workflation.
Yeah.
Where everybody just has to be an amazing public humanist and a social media queen and and a documentary filmmaker and a monograph writer. We don't want that either, right? So thank you for that.
Hi, I had a question about the relationship between research and teaching and how we might institutionally, or use this word of infrastructure, support that more. I'm someone who thinks of them as being co-constitutive, right? I started my second monograph about freedom and resistance in African American political thought, and then I thought, well, let me talk to all my good, smart students about that. So I created a seminar, and then I led that seminar, and that helped me sharpen the argument in my book. I taught that seminar again. The book's further along, so now my ideas are more developed. I'm writing essays public facing about my experience teaching the idea of the ideas of black women in the classroom, and that shaping the monograph. But I'm kind of bound in some of these obstacles, so I'm also trying to get leave via the ACLS so that I can make more progress on my book. But I've actually been thinking about asking my colleagues here, well, could I continue teaching that even if I got that fantastic leave, could I still teach my seminar? Because actually I think of that as helping me with my book, but would that be allowed institutionally from the association, and would my colleagues here at WashU be supportive of that? And then relating back to the problems I found in, I'm non-tenure track, so I teach a 3-3 here. So I'm doing research and I value my research, and my students value my research. But I'm slowing down in the book as I'm trying to continue to deliver these innovative courses. So I'm bound on both sides, which I'm just offering up as an anecdotal episode. But again, think about how we think about institutionally teaching, institutionally research, all of the university as a system, associations as systems. How do we all support this on all layers, all sides, so that we can all continue doing this exciting stuff after the leave ends and after the seminar ends, and continue the work forward. Do you both have ideas about that? Yeah.
What rewards do you get from the university for doing research?
None. I have
Okay,
very
that
little support.
okay.
When you talk about institutional support, I have very little. So I have the support I have is the support of my colleagues, that they are excited about me and my work and my teaching, and they help me. But from the university, I have very little support. But couldn't we support, right?
But that's not going to. Would it help you to get promoted or not?
Lynn's shaking her head no, but we're talking about reimagining what that would mean, and I'm saying, shouldn't this be something we could institutionally support such that would be promotable? That's it.
This seems like a great transition to our next panel on opportunity.
Okay. Opportunity. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.